The Enlightened Work Podcast is brought to you by Culture QI, the Culture and Talent Activation Company. With music by Geek Chorus. This episode is produced and edited by Alex Olson. For more content and engagement, follow the Enlightened Work Podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
Welcome back, Enlightened Leaders, to our 6th episode, digging deep into one of our 10 Enlightened Leadership Behaviors. In our last episode, we talked about growth mindset and what it actually means in the context of leadership in a work setting. This episode, we move into our next ELB, which is the power duo of optimism and hope. I don't know about you, Meena, but I am so excited to dig into this topic for you listeners today. So I was raised by power of positive thinking parents. My 90-year-old mother had a master's degree in psychology and drilled into me from an early age how to reframe my negative thoughts. And my father, who's now 92, was a businessman, and he used to always tell us as kids when we thought we were getting sick that it was just our negative attitude. Legit, he wanted us to think away our colds. And so I think they also, as parents, though, both instilled in our family hope for the future, hope in our fellow human beings, and hope in our abilities to make a difference in the world. So despite my own inclinations as a person to maybe be a little anxious or negative at times, I'd like to believe I lead with optimism and hope, in large part because of my parents.
Well, Heather, at least part of that certainly resonated with me. My dad would always say to me, "It's all in your head," whenever I felt like I was going to throw up, or even while I was throwing up. So can relate to that. I'm super excited about the deep dive, as my research uncovered many interesting studies, which I can't wait to share. But first, let's start where we always start, which is providing some context and definitions. And let's outline the delineation between optimism and hope.
So is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, there definitely is. Optimism is a belief about outcomes. It's a prediction mindset, such as, I believe things will turn out well. It actually can lead to complacency, which is interesting. It's cognitive and future-oriented. The problem is optimism can wobble when reality gets tough because it's tied to expectations. Think of optimism as a belief in positive outcomes.
Okay, I think I'm tracking on what optimism is.
So hope, on the other hand, is a belief about what is possible. Hope is rooted in resilience, in a resilience mindset. Basically, hope says, even if I don't know how this will turn out, I believe it's still worth trying. And therein kind of lies the difference, the trying. Hope does not require certainty that optimism does about the future, and it's better at persisting in spite of difficulty. Hope tends to hold steady even when optimism isn't realistic. Hope is a commitment to possibility even under uncertainty. And I want to stress that with hope, there's much more of a feeling of agency, and that you as an individual can impact outcomes.
Okay, so optimism is maybe a little bit more weather dependent, and it can slip into toxic positivity. We've heard about that term quite a bit, where you're unrealistically looking at the situation. And therefore, optimism can certainly fail if things do not go your way. However, if I'm understanding correctly, hope is deeper, it's more durable, and it kind of makes room for the hard times that inevitably happen. Does that sound right?
I think so. If we're going to anthropomorphize these optimism and hope, optimism says, this quarter will be amazing and we'll hit all our targets. Hope says, even if this quarter is brutal, we can still have the ability to try to make something meaningful. So let's talk about the brain science a little bit behind these two beliefs. Although both optimism and hope are future-oriented, Our brain uses different systems for each. So, very interestingly, hope is actually more active in terms of the brain pathways it turns on.
I find this so fascinating, Meena. So MRIs have actually shown that optimism shows up in the parts of the brain that help you expect good outcomes, which I think is called the orbital frontal cortex, to be exact, if I said that right. And it helps you dial down anxiety. Hope taps into I think it's called take action part of your brain, including the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of planning and problem solving. And hope also activates the supplementary motor area, which links your intentions to actions. So basically, having hope turns this, I want this to happen, into I will help make this happen.
That's right. Studies have shown that hopeful people are actually more effective than just optimistic people, because hopeful people make plans for and work toward the future they want. In one study, hope, but not optimism, predicted performance among law students. In another study, hopeful executives from Fortune 100 companies performed more effectively at work and produced more creative solutions to problems than less hopeful ones, even when accounting for intelligence.
That is so fascinating, I think. So then why do leaders, or as we like to call them, our enlightened leaders, need both optimism and hope?
Leaders set the emotional tone in their organization and/or on their team. And optimism and hope play different but complementary roles in shaping how teams feel, think, and act. Leading with optimism gives people the belief that progress is possible. It creates psychological safety, lowers anxiety, and helps teams see opportunities instead of threat. That's optimism. Hope is very actionable. It helps people break big goals into small steps that they can execute, and reinforces that even if the future is unclear, the team still has the power to influence it. That's key.
Yep.
When used together in leadership, optimism and hope create confidence and direction, positivity and perseverance, vision and action. That's kind of the key. If optimism and hope are missing, this creates a very problematic void.
Oh, yes, problematic void. I have been in those organizations during those challenging times when it feels like the entire workplace is spiraling because leaders are not effectively leading with or communicating optimism and hope. And when that happens, it's hard to see. I mean, teams lose psychological safety, they stop problem solving, their motivation and engagement plummets, and employee resilience weakens, which just leads to more burnout, decreased productivity, increased turnover, and ultimately bad business results.
Ooh, this sounds depressing. And it's really because when optimism and hope are missing, our brains move into threat mode. The amygdala gets louder, the prefrontal cortex goes quieter, and motivation systems slow down. We see more danger and fewer possibilities. And the people around us feel it too. Teams pick up that fear, they stop taking risks, they get more rigid, and the whole organization becomes less creative and less resilient. It's part of a vicious spiral that's very hard to stop.
It is. You know, I worked with a company that was in one of those spirals, and it took a very concerted effort and multi-pronged strategies across, I think, probably 2 years to stop the decline and start turning things around. I'm sure, Meena, you're familiar with the term emotional contagion, and it is a very real dynamic that impacts organizational culture because we humans subconsciously sync to the emotional signals of leaders and our teammates. So a leader, if they're operating from threat and negativity, will actually trigger collective anxiety, collective hypervigilance, and defensiveness. in their team and the people they're trying to lead. And the same goes for your teammates. So one negative coworker can absolutely impact the entire team dynamic. And I love using the analogy of the moldy strawberry when talking about this to people. So just think about what happens to a plastic container of strawberries if there are one or maybe two moldy strawberries sitting at the bottom. In a matter of a day, the entire container can go bad. So what do, right? You try to seek out the moldy strawberry and you get rid of them to save the entire pint. Now, you can't trash an entire organization or a bunch of negative people in your team if their optimism and hope start to wane. But leaders absolutely can and should work to turn things around.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I think some parts of our workforce have shifted from empathetic to cynical over the last few years. But when leaders care about employee well-being and the success of their firms, they place rebuilding trust and hope at the top of their strategic agendas. And leaders certainly need to know how to pull their teams out of a negative spiral or avoid it altogether, ideally.
Yeah.
So let's get into some practical, specific behaviors you can demonstrate to encourage optimism and hope.
So here are 3 actions I think are very important for leaders to take today to start leading with optimism and hope. 1, use optimism in your communications. This will create clarity and calm. Now, we still want you to be transparent when you're communicating, but to have that tone of optimism and positivity. So this sounds like being honest and stating, here's what we know, here's what's working well for us, here's what's working in our favor, here's why things are on the right path, or even these are why things aren't working out and this is what we're going or what we can do about it so that we can start making a turn. So using some of that optimism language. 2, you can start using hopeful messaging as well in your communications and your meeting with your team members to really create that forward momentum. Now, this sounds a little different, like here's our next steps that we need to take. Here's a new pathway we can try. Here is what we can do to influence the outcome into a positive trajectory. And then finally, 3, you as a leader need to be modeling both optimism and hope in your presence and how you show up. Meaning, keep your composure and self-regulate, especially when things are challenging. And ensure you're speaking with only a future positive tone to really help your members find practical and disciplined actions that they can take and to keep their orientation and movement going forward.
I love these. And I would also add to focus on prioritizing culture strategies to move employees, team, and organizations forward, and to instill optimism and hope. I read a blog by the co-founder of the Work Better Institute, Jennifer Moss. She suggested 7 specific actions to instill optimism and hope in your teams. So I'm just going to kind of go through these, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the first one is invest in reskilling and upskilling. This reduces fears of obsolescence and gives workers the skills they need to meet future demand and instills hope. I think that one is incredibly important and incredibly relevant, especially with AI.
Well, and if you have people, employees who are under the threat of thinking they're going to be laid off, right? Making that small investment in reskilling them and encouraging their continuous growth and development is going to give them some optimism and hope for their future.
Yeah. Agreed, 100%. The next thing she says is number 2, be explicit when setting expectations. Above and beyond is not a concrete goal. So provide clear guidelines, ensure when goals that are attainable, and recognize and reward when objectives are met.
So there's nothing more demoralizing and demotivating than having goals set that are impossible to achieve. So
that's why we go back to SMART goals. I mean, I think you and I are proponents of SMART goals.
Exactly. So I think it seems simple, but at the same token, making sure you've got reasonable expectations, and clear guidelines will help your employees feel like, in fact, they can have forward momentum and achieve what they want to achieve and you want them to achieve.
Agreed. Number 3, provide consistent but flexible feedback. Feedback, as we all know, should be direct, timely, and personalized.
Yeah. I mean, if communications aren't happening and employees don't know where they stand, they're going to get in their heads. They're going to get stressed. They're going to tell themselves stories. But if you're keeping the communication and feedback flowing, then they don't, they can operate from a place of I'm getting better and I'm improving.
Right. And then her 4th, I love this. This is all about hope. Embrace agency. People are more intrinsically motivated when they've been involved in defining and meeting their own goals. If we want our teams to be more entrepreneurial and innovative while reducing learned helplessness, it is key to empower everyone to solve problems in their own way.
That's right. And it's the opposite of micromanaging, right? It's actually empowering people to do things that make sense in a way that makes them feel like they have ownership and accountability. Here's a few more that I really liked on her list. 5, respect change fatigue. So make sure the change that you're making adds significant value right now. Or if it's not a good time, just wait, right? There's a lot going on in organizations. There's a lot of change that's happening very quickly. So manage and monitor how change is happening. And if change is imminent, because it will happen, and sometimes you just have to implement it, exercise empathy while you are walking people, guiding people through that change. 6, celebrate. And celebrate even when we deviate, and which is going to happen, right? Employees fail, mistakes happen. But if you can let go of that mistake and reframe it as an opportunity for continuous improvement, like we talked about with growth mindset, people feel like they'll have psychological safety to try out new ideas without getting in trouble. They'll feel safe to take more risks. And having that continuous improvement mindset and growth mindset actually contributes to building a cycle of hope. And then 7, really allow for recovery and respect that rest for ourselves and for our employees are going to help keep us in a emotionally regulated space, and it will allow us to be critical thinking individuals as opposed to reactionary people. So really monitor your team members and make sure that there is manageable workloads, that you're never piling so much work on top of them that they start to feel hopelessness in terms of their ability to ever get it done. Because when people start to question the point of their efforts, they get disengaged and they become less productive. And then their workload becomes even more unmanageable because it just creates this vicious cycle. So allowing people to rest and take vacations and take a free day at home, I think all of that is a prerequisite for productivity. And so leaders need to encourage it and they need to model it so that their employees feel like their rest is supported. So those are some great tactics that we reviewed for leaders to apply in their work setting. And I think unsurprisingly, many of them echo back to the fundamentals of a growth mindset. And I just love how these ELBs of ours are so intertwined. But before we wrap up, I think one final point, at least I feel the need to say, when the world feels scary and chaotic, it is so critically important for leaders to monitor their own mindsets, their mood, their behavior, so that they show up as regulated and compassionate. And leaders have to consciously create a work environment that recognizes the chaos, yet intentionally instills hope and optimism into their team's day-to-day experience. And I think that wraps up our lively conversation on why both hope and optimism are critical in enlightened leadership behaviors, and also sharing how you as a leader can demonstrate and instill them in your workforce to help your business succeed and thrive. So thanks for joining us. Stay optimistic and hopeful. And until next time, be the good.
Be the good.